זכרתי לך כה אמר השם. זכרתי לך חסד נעורייך, אהבת גלולותייך, אהבת גלולותייך, אהבת גלולותייך. לך תך אחריי, אחריי במדבר בארץ לא זרועה. לך תך אחריי, אחריי במדבר בארץ לא זרועה.
Shabbos, everybody. Good Shabbos. Boker Tov. Shabbat Shalom. Hi. Wow, it's been a long time since I've been here early in the morning, at Shabbat morning. You guys are up bright and early. I love it. There's a Yofi. Okay. Let's, the Amy is showing us something going on in Florida, or I can't see quite, but okay. Shell's oil drilling plans. Okay, good. That's a success. It's a good way to wake up in the morning. Okay, to all of you here, good morning, and we're going to begin learning. I hope everybody has their coffee. You're all good. You have your coffee, your tea, your whatever it is, whatever time zone you're in. We're going to learn a little Torah today. Let's see. Let's see, where'd that go? Okay, there it is. Great. Okay, let's see. Let's get a little Birchat Torah going here so we can get started. Parshat Bo is a pretty juicy parsha. All kinds of good things happening in Parshat Bo. And let's see, someone's hand is up. Okay, Amy, did you want to say something?
I just want to say for the past 8 years, I and hundreds of other people have been fighting to ban fracking in Florida. This is the last oil drilling that I know about that would have occurred in Florida. With this being shelved, we may have effectively banned fracking in Florida. Thank you, God. Can we dedicate the class to all the wonderful people who fought to keep Florida from fracking? Thank you. And it's also Elvis's birthday.
Okay, from Elvis to fracking, I thank you for waking us up with good news, Elvis and fracking. In the Hasidic Masters class, and actually as a practice too, in this class, I like what you just did there, and I just want to invite others to dedicate today's learning also to those in the chat area. I know, Anna, this might be a bit of a shift here, but I know that you're dexterous. So you can allow people to just chat into the chat area the names of loved ones and others who are in need of healing, or all those who are being dedicated for whatever reason you want to dedicate today's learning. It's a common practice in learning Torah to dedicate learning to for the sake of sentient beings, sometimes in our Buddhist chevra, but here also we can specify. So for the sake of those who fought for justice and for the health of the planet, and for any other dedication, I invite you to place that in. And we're going to get some Birchot Torah. So let's see, Brother Daniel, can you take on Birchot Torah? Can you see that, Daniel Berlin?
Yes, I would be happy to. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen. 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 For those who need this as a PD, the link to this in Safari, is that what you're needing now, Anna? I just want to make sure if that's what's going on. I can give that to you too. Here's the link. Thank you, Brother Daniel. That was beautiful. Amen v'amen. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So the psukim that I wanted to look at today, the verses that I wanted to look at today, are from chapter 12 in Bo, and the verses begin very ominous, very beautiful beginning, even if it's a very difficult part of the Torah portion and part of the Torah itself, the Makah Bechorot, the plague of the firstborn. But I'm not actually going to focus on that part of this reading, but towards the latter verses beginning further down as you'll see in the verses. So maybe we begin with a reader. Anybody like to read? Let's see. Anybody whose face is here. I'm going to read in the Hebrew, and maybe Sue Ann, can you unmute and read in the English with me?
Yeah.
We'll go Hebrew, English, okay? So, Vayiba Chatzi Halayla, Vadonai Ka Kol Bechor Be'eretz Mitzrayim, Bechor Paro Yoshev Al Kiso, Ad Bechor Shevi Asher Beveit Abor, Vechol Bechor Behema.
In the middle of the night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle.
Vayakam Paro Laila, Hu Vechol Avada Vechol Mitzrayim, Vatehi Tzaka Gedola BeMitzrayim, Ki Ein Bayit, Asher Ein Sham Meit.
And Pharaoh arose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead.
Vayikra leMoshe uleAharon Laila, Vayomer Kumu Tz'u Mitoch Ami, Gam Atem, Gam Bnei Yisrael, Ulechu Ivdu, let me get it there, Et Adonai Kidar Berchem. 31.
He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go, worship the Lord as you said."
Gam tzonchem, gam bekarchem kichu, kasher dibartem valechu, uverachtem gam oti.
Take also your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and may you bring a blessing upon me also.
Vatechazak Mitzrayim al ha'am lemaher l'shalacham min haaretz, ki amru kulanu meitim.
The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, "We shall all be dead."
Vayisa am et betzeko term yechmatz, mish'arotam tzirurot besimlotam al shechmam.
So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders.
Uvenei Yisrael asu ki devar Moshe, vayish alu mimitzrayim kle chesef uchle zahav usmalot.
The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing.
Vadonai natan et chen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim vayash ilum, vayinatzelu et Mitzrayim.
And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus they stripped the Egyptians.
Thank you, Suran. Makah Bechorot, the final, right? This final moment, the denouement, the moment where everything is building towards, which brings us full circle to the beginning of the Exodus narrative, where male children are being are being slaughtered or being murdered, and this kind of karmic retribution, this kind of this finishing, as it were, of the story, and begins with kind of a very, the pain of the content, though, is doesn't deny the beauty, as it were, of the laconic phrasing of it, right? And Pharaoh wakes up night, right? Vayakam para laila, in the night, and then night. There's all kinds of darkness happening here, and of course, they've just come out of Makat Choshech, which has come out of the darkness plague, and here, darkness, of course, in the most profound sense, is descended upon Egypt, and the reader is brought into this, right? B'chatzi alayla, into the splitting of the night. It was at the splitting of the night. Night appears over and over again, and then, of course, the crying and the remarkable request from Pharaoh: leave, and when you leave, though, don't forget to give me a blessing. Or as the rabbis say, he wanted a blessing because he himself was a firstborn and wanted to make sure that he would be okay, or is it a blessing, as most of the commentators say, for the, that we'd be done with these plagues and bless this nation as you leave. All of this, of course, leads up to the scene of the Israelites rushing out and in speed, right? Terem yachmatz, they have to take their dough, and they leave, and so on. And then at the end of this, verses 35 and 36, Uvnei Israel asu kidvar Moshe, and the children of Israel do according to the word of Moshe. And they yish'alu mi Mitzrayim, they asked of the Egyptians. That's the phrase, of course, that is the most the oddest phrase, and also the most ambiguous. What does it mean to ask of the Egyptians? Does it mean to borrow, as it says in English? They borrowed vessels of silver and vessels of gold and clothing, smalot. And verse 36 tells us, Vadonai natan et chena am be'enei Mitzrayim v'ashilum. And God places the chen, the charm, or the favor of the nation, meaning of the Israelites, in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they indeed, loaned or lent these things, and thus vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim, and then this other strange word vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim, they stripped the Egyptians, or they stole, or they took. Rashi, of course, doesn't really know, as all of us are also confused. When it says in this narrative, and the Israelites did as Moshe had spoken to them, we don't really know where Moshe had spoken to them, because in the immediate verses that we just read, there is no commandment, or there's no word of Moshe to refer to. But so of course Rashi brings us back to an earlier time in the Torah, in chapter 11, at the very beginning of chapter 11, where Moshe indeed said to the Israelites, "Vayishalu ish me'et re'eu," that they are to ask one from his fellow for these gifts, or for these reparations of sorts. If you look here in source number 4, that's the fuller verses that Rashi, the fuller verse that Rashi is referring to. So that here in chapter 12, where Uvnei Israel asu kidvar Moshe, and the Israelites did according to the word of Moshe, this is the word of Moshe that is being referenced, right? Daber na be'oznei ha'am, Moshe says to them, V'ish'alu ish me'et re'eu, v'isha me'et re'uta, klei kesef u'klei zahav. Right? Tell the people to borrow. There's that word again, to borrow, lish'ol. She'ela means to ask a question, right? But in the parlance of the rabbis, in the Mishnah, and also in other places in the Torah itself too, to lish'ol can mean to borrow, depending on whether or not what is the prefix or what is the suffix, what object, how it's being phrased. Vayishalu et, it lish'ol me'et. You can, just like in English, to ask for is to ask for a gift, to ask of, or, there are various ways that we use the word asking that can actually change the context and the meaning of the word. To ask about is to make an inquiry. So here the word asking in Hebrew, lish'ol, here is being used as borrowing, and or it could mean something else too, but here it's being translated that way. So Moshe says to the people in chapter 11, speak in the ears of the nation, right? And tell them to borrow from their neighbors these objects of gold and silver. Now, what's remarkable about that source, right, just in terms of this, what is actually being, what's happening here? As the Israelites are leaving, they're taking gold, they're taking silver, and it's an important part of this narrative. It seems to come out of nowhere. What is it for? Rashi has pointed us back to chapter 11, right? Here in chapter 12, where the plague of the firstborn is taking place, the very end of it says, and the Israelites didn't forget to do as Moshe had bid them to do. Where did Moshe bid them to do this? Back in chapter 11, which we just saw. Rashi in chapter 11, and with the rabbis, is bothered by the little small word na, right? If you look here in verse 2 in chapter 11, it says, speak please, which is not translated in the English, right? In the English, it doesn't say the word na or please, but in Hebrew, the phrase is daber na, please. And so Rashi is bothered by that, and so are the rabbis who came before Rashi, the great Rashi from France. And what does Rashi say the word na points to? Ein na ela lashon bakasha. The word na, the little word na, the nun aleph, na, is request. It's an expression of entreating. Bivakasha mincha hizirem al kach. Shelo yomar ota tzadik. Like the reason why please is being used here, according to Rashi and according to the rabbis, in a very midrashic expansion on the word na, the entreating here is please tell the Israelites to go ahead and ask of their neighbors these things, because Shelo yomar otot tzadik Avraham v'avadum v'inu otam kiyem bahem v'achrechen yetzu b'rechush gadol lo kiyem bahem. This is a remarkable Rashi based upon an earlier source. When Moses goes to the people to ask them to go to their neighbors and ask for gifts, or to borrow gifts, or demand gifts, or whatever is happening here, the word na signals to Rashi, the word na, we mean please, signals that there's a worry, a concern, that the tzaddik, meaning Abraham, back in chapter 15, when Abraham was promised in the prophecy called Brit Ben Abtarim, the prophecy of the covenant of the pieces, he was promised that your people would go down, and he was told that they would go down to Egypt and they would suffer there, and that suffering, right, though would have an end where there would be rechush gadol, where they would leave with great wealth. And the Midrash here imagines a scared God, as it were, saying, the great righteous tzaddik, the righteous one, Abraham, will say, you made a promise, but you only made good on the first part of it. The first part, they suffered for 410 years, for 400 years, 210 years. But that last part of the prophecy, you didn't come through, right? They experienced the suffering, but they didn't experience the prophecy that they would leave with great wealth. And here, a God, right, who is commanding Moshe to tell the people, speak to them and tell them to do their part, is worried that if the Israelites don't do their part, then it'll be as if I didn't come through on the fullness of the prophecy, the fullness of the promise. It's remarkable, right? This is where it's from, right? If you look at chapter 15, Vayomer la'Avraham yado teda ki ger yezarcha be'eretz lo lahem. We're in source 6 here, right? This is where the Gemara in Brachot and Rashi's quoting it comes from, right? That there's a prophecy, ger yezarcha be'eretz lo lahem, your people, your progeny, your future, Abraham, they will be gerim, they'll be aliens, they'll be foreign in a land, they'll be strangers in a land that isn't theirs, and they will indeed suffer. They'll be enslaved 400 years. But I will judge I will execute judgment. I will bring judgment on the people who enslaved them. But after Yetz'u b'rechush gadol, they will leave with great wealth. This is the kind of what's happening here at the end of chapter 12. At the end of chapter 12, the Israelites are leaving. They're asking. They're borrowing. There's reparations. There's something happening, and in the mind of the rabbis, this is the fulfillment of a prophetic promise that is fraught with anxiety, right? An anxiety of slavery, of a suffering without recompense, a suffering without justice, a suffering without some sense of payback, right? There's a kind of fraught narrative underneath here, right? There's the Israelites listened to what Moshe had told them to do, sounding as if they weren't going to do it on their own. It was something that Moshe asked of them, as it were, that they might not have had that inclination, that they might not have had that desire, right? That Moshe was asking. And why was Moshe asking it of them? And so according to Rashi, at least in one understanding, right, they're doing the bidding of an anxious divine promise, a divine promise that hangs in the air, that this great suffering will have some reward, some payback, some silver, literally silver linings and silver and gold linings, right? That there'll be something here for them to extract from this experience, right? Now, I'm going to do one more source, and I'm going to open it up for a little bit before we go. The question of what motivates this moment, right? Is it the bidding of an anxious God, or is it actually something about justice, or is it also something about what the Israelites need to do for their own souls, something that they actually needed to do in order for them to be able to overcome some bitterness? Is something that will be a question. I just want to look at this in the understanding of, in the second understanding of what motivates, not just an anxious God who promised our ancestors that their suffering would have reward, right? Yesh schar le'fulatech, that there's some reward for all of this suffering. There's a second image here of, I think, a more common understanding of reparations, right? A sense of justice and a sense of there being a need for there to be a setting of the record straight. If you look at this Talmudic story, it's a remarkable story. It takes place in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 91a. Pam achat ba'u b'nei Mitzrayim ladun im Yisrael lifnei Alexandrus Mokdon. Right? One occasion, the people of Egypt came to judgment with the Jewish people before Alexander of Macedon. This is likely Alexandrians who are, right, the connection with Egypt here is kind of fraught, but a group of people came to Egypt to come to judgment about the Jewish people and complain to Alexander of Macedon. The Egyptian people said to Alexander, Rehu Omer, Adonai natan etchein ha'am be'einei Mitzrayim vayashilum. They quote the verse in this remarkable story. The Egyptian delegation come before the powerful Alexander of Macedon to judge the Jewish people in the Talmudic rendering here. And they quote a verse in chapter 12, the verses that we're about to read this morning in Shul, the ones that we just saw. And God put the chen, the charm of the people, in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they gave them, or they borrowed from them, and they took the silver and gold. And this Egyptian delegation said, give us the silver and the gold that you took from us. Right? Amar Geviha ben Psisa. This Geviah, the son of Psisa, says to the sages on the side, to the Jewish delegation, the Chachamim, Tnuli Reshut ve'elech ve'aduni mahem lifnei Alexandrus. He says, give me permission. I'm going to go and be the representative of the Jews. I want to be the defendant, the defense attorney. Let me go advocate for us. If we win, if the Egyptians win, right, you can say that I'm the stupidest amongst you. And so that will be the excuse. I'm the stupidest amongst all the sages, and so you can blame me. Right? But if we win, you can say that the Torah, V'imanim enatzech otam, amru lahem Torah Moshe. If I win, tell them that the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu nitzachtem. Then you can say the Torah is the great, right? It's the Torah that won. So they gave him permission, and he goes and he stands before Alexander of Macedon, and he says, Amrulo. He says to me, where did you get your proof that we owe you money? Did you not quote a verse from our Torah? They said, Amrulo min Torah. We brought a verse from the Torah. The Torah, right, is our source. The Torah told us that our ancestors gave you gold and silver. So he says to them, he says, Elam in Torah. He says, if you're going to bring a proof from the Torah, then I'll also bring a proof from the Torah. Moshe ben Israel asher yashu b'Mitzrayim 30 shana ve'arba me'ot shana. Says we were living in Egypt for 430 years. Tenu lanu schar avodah shel 60 ribot sheshe'abtem b'Mitzrayim 30 shana ve'arba me'ot shana. He says, if that's the case, if your proof is from the Torah, then I'll bring a proof too. The Torah says that we served you for 430 years. That's 600,000 people serving daily. You owe us wages for 430 years, 600,000 at a pop. Says, right? So it's like, snap. So, Amar lem Alexandrus Mokdon, Hachzir lo tshuva. So Alexander of Macedon says to the Egyptian delegation, can you give them an answer? Tanu lanu zman. They said, yeah, give us some time, we'll be right back. 3 days passed, and they had no answer. And miyad hinichu, and that's it. That was it. They ran, and that's the end of the story. It's an interesting story, right? And the story essentially highlights that, right? It highlights the sense of the motivation behind this is, on some level, right, a minimal amount of reparations for the Israelites as they left. This second, and then the third piece here, and then we'll come back. Josephus, in his writings on this, wrote very briefly, the Egyptians honored them with these gifts in order to hasten their departure. Others gave out of good neighborliness and friendship they had for them. When they went forth from Egypt, the Egyptians wept and had remorse for how they had treated them. A third, decidedly different understanding of this gift is that it is indeed a gift. That the usage of the term to ask is decidedly not in the frequency or in the tenor or in the key of justice or in the key of making good on a promise and a prophetic anxiety from the divine, right? That somehow there would be a scale that would measure the suffering against what was given. It's a decidedly humanistic understanding of she'elah, of giving as a gift. They said, we feel horribly, right? In Josephus's understanding, this gift was given as a kind of forgiveness, right? Not forgetting, not forget, but forgive. And that the giving here was given as a kind of neighborliness that would express a modicum of remorse, a modicum of connection between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Now, we're going to stop here. There's a fourth rendering that comes from Beno Jacob and from a reading of the text in a bit of a different valence. But I just want to say that the reading here of giving them something, even as they leave, from the place of goodness and a sense of neighborliness, is underscored by the way that the Torah will later legally codify when Hebrew slaves will leave their Hebrew slave owners. They are to be sent with gifts as well. As if the Torah is saying, of course, and in the context of a Hebrew slave, servitude for Hebrew slaves was based on economic opportunity. When someone had fallen into poverty, there was a way for them to work for their wages. And even when they left, the Torah tells us that they are to be sent with klei chesed uchlei zahav uzmalot, the very same phrase that takes place, that the very things that are being asked of the Egyptians in later Jewish law becomes the very thing that a Jewish slave owner must give their Hebrew slave. And so there's a sense here that there, of course, is not reparations at all. There's a sense of giving someone something to start their life over, and a sense that underscores the understanding of Josephus in Antiquities. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for your comments, your questions, what came up. We'll begin with Jill, and then we'll work our way down. Go ahead, Jill.
Thank you so much for this teaching. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So yeah, I was thinking about how earlier the Jewish people were not allowed out of slavery until we moaned. So complained, moaned, for lack of a better word, something negative. So first, it seems like the first action needs to really be showing the injustice and really putting it, back in the face of the oppressor. But when it comes to recompense, it is being an example of what you would have liked in terms of your treatment to be able to successfully get the recompense that you deserve.
So you're saying here there's a moment here of you're working from the beginning of the Exodus story where the Israelites cry out. There's an anacha, there's a sighing, and then there's this acknowledgement of injustice. That is the sequence, as it were. Like there needs to be an acknowledgement of injustice before there can be. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and then, like I said, on the other side, very remarkably, especially from the Rashi teaching or interpretation, is that it's asking, it's basically showing what justice looks like, in terms of the grace and the not becoming like the oppressor in what when you demand not a demand but a request, if that makes sense.
Yes. So I think that right. So we're going to actually the last motivation, last interpretation for what motivated this borrowing or this taking of the Egyptians' property is going to really underscore this last phrase that you said of not becoming the oppressor, and how it works for the sake of the Israelites in terms of their own heart and mind. So we're actually going to go there, and so I thank you for that. Okay, Sarah Tova, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I feel quite differently. I feel like it's a way of, throughout the Torah at the beginning, we see how people's bad behaviors, they're kind of frankly written, and I feel like this was bad behavior again, that we're just making excuses for our bad behavior. Often people pillage they pillage to cause pain, for retribution. The other part that I find interesting is, what is gold and silver going to do for them in the desert? They can't eat gold and silver. They can't survive with gold and silver. And the Egyptians understand this. They get rid of it. That just for life, what gold and silver have no value whatsoever. And then we use the gold and silver the gold to have a golden calf, which again has no power. It's useless. It's a false god. So what's the big deal about robbing and taking advantage of the Egyptians? It's a false god. To me, it's a message of, okay, we got this stuff, we thought it would help us, but in the end, it's actually useless. We can't eat it. We can't grow. We won't survive. In fact, that generation will all die off.
Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to what you just said. I certainly am not I think you know this, and others who have been a part of this community for a long time know that we're not big fans of whitewashing. Kind of tell it like it is, and apologetics. I think it takes courage to name an apologetic. I think that I'm slightly less sympathetic in the sense that there is. I think that there's, if I try to imagine what it might have been like for, African Americans to leave their plantations, and when I try to imagine what it would have been like for, for my great grandparents to leave Germany or to leave Poland, or to go back there, and I'm not altogether sure that I'm unsympathetic to this moment psychologically and psychospiritually. I think to some degree, the Torah is so often so human and so frail and so fraught in its humanity. Sometimes it's just so we think, can you rise to another level? Sometimes in Torah, we're thinking that sometimes Torah verses actually show humanity at its worst sometimes, and the Torah itself, the 7 nations, other moments of deep and clear injustice. But here I'm not so sure. Like, I get it. Like, I think that there's a part of us that reads that and thinks, certainly, wow, I can't believe the Torah is recording that the Israelites went to their neighbors and asked them for gold and silver. But I think that we lose sometimes a sense of who the powerful ones are in that narrative, right? The Egyptians are not innocent, and the Egyptian culture is not innocent. And so I guess the question then becomes, is there ever a place for retributive justice, ever, in any context? Is there ever a place? And is there ever a place also where that is, radically just in that sense? Here it's financial recompense. And again, I think that in the reading, it's the softening of some of the readings is that they ask them as a favor. So I think that your comment is really on point, maybe for the first two, but certainly in the last reading that we saw from Josephus, and certainly from let's say from Kasuto, which we didn't read, but that there's a sense of this being they really asked them, and the Egyptians gave from a place of wanting to set them up for success, and that's another reading here. But I appreciate your voice and appreciate what you brought. I think there's some truth to that too. So thank you. Okay. Lauren, go ahead.
Hey, Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
So I, like Sarah, was going to go to the golden calf because I see the anxiety of this moment also caught up in what transpires, in what the Israelites do with this gold and silver, which actually is eventually, yes, it builds the Israelites use it to build the golden calf, which eventually then is ground down, right? The gold is ground down into a powder, which the Israelites are then made to drink. So ultimately it is ingested. So that to me, I guess metabolized. Well, they are, you're right, but they are actually forced to consume it. I guess, Sarah, I wouldn't necessarily say though that it's worthless. It's part of what teaches, it's a teaching moment. It becomes a teaching moment for the Israelites. And sometimes we just screw up with what we're given with our material goods. It's painful. It's incredibly painful, but maybe there's something useful about that lesson as well. We go on, we become a monotheistic community after what transpires.
Well, I'm going to bring it to, not yet, but I want to just bring what you're saying, Lauren, into the Kabbalistic and Hasidic reading of this whole moment. We're going to get to that, I hope, towards the end, but it's very similar to what you're saying in terms of what from this was useful and what from this might have been instructive or teaching moment. And as many of you know, that I gave a sermon about that smoothie, the golden calf smoothie that we had to drink, and the ingesting of that, and how to. I think it's powerful to imagine that we were asked to metabolize the karma of these gold and silver things. I think that that's very powerful for you to bring that, and so I thank you for bringing that. All right, thanks, Lauren. Paul, go ahead. You're live on Open Book in Shabbat morning.
And I'm happy to be here. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
I'm going to thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. I too was going to mention that. And just one last word on the ingestion. What happens after you ingest? You expel. But as a separate thought, perhaps it makes sense to think of gold and silver less concretely, but metaphorically. And the ambiguity of the ask, the language ambiguity, perhaps is a description of what I am thinking as its inevitability, that the Jews, the Israelites, were in Egypt for 430 years. And so it is completely inevitable that they took with them cultural wealth from Egypt. And that is not so easy to expel. I would argue impossible. And the Torah recognizes that, and it emphasizes its importance by its ambiguous language.
Yeah, so I thank you, Paul, for that. I think that we're going to come back. I want to come back to the allegorical gifts, as it were, and the ambiguity of that word. I think that you're spot on with that. I think that at least in the over 2,000 years since these texts were given or written, there's a lot on that idea, and we're going to come back to that. And so I thank you for bringing that too, and we'll come back to both what you had said and Lauren said in a couple of minutes. Ilana, go ahead. Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Ilana.
So much wonderful Torah. So I wanted to offer something that's an and also. And maybe this is where we were going to go with the Hasidic masters and the Zohar, but I'm going back to Exodus 11:2, and I've noticed May 8, at is mentioned twice. And as is so often taught in Kabbalah or in the Meor Einayim, I believe, that is a reference to Shekhinah. So I am taken with the possibility of reading this as a kind of pathway that the Egyptians are on, that they get to give from Shekhinah. And that you could read the text as, as an indication that they're, instead of drawing from their participation in oppression, with this gift, they get to engage and draw from Shekhinah. And that, so not only could this be read, as Josephus does, as a gift from them to the Israelites, but it's a kind of healing for the Egyptians, that they get to enact this Shekhinah part of themselves.
So the as far as I know, in the renderings of the Hasidic masters and of Kabbalah, it doesn't really take that perspective as a tikkun for the Mitzrim, for the Egyptians that you just took, right? The focus is still on the Israelites and on the Jews, and so I think that's unique what you just added, and I think it's very beautiful to imagine this as a tikkun and a healing for the Egyptians themselves to participate in their own, like, not just on the level of reparations and justice and equity, but from the place of tikkun of their soul, that this is a quality that's being drawn forth from them in terms of Shekhinah and the presence of Shekhinah. And I think that's very beautiful. We're going to come to a piece that will highlight the Israelites, but not the Egyptians. So I think that's a chidush, and I think it's very beautiful. And yes, 8 is often, yes, at is a Shekhinah. Okay, it's very beautiful. Roberta, go ahead. Thank you, Ilana.
Yeah. Wow.
Each one of these is so beautiful. But go ahead, Roberta.
I was sort of taking in what Ilana just shared, and yes, and another yes, and for me, the whole story, what's echoing in my head is my liberation is bound up with yours, and that it's not only our vision of the world as what we've received now is this completely divided, separated humanity at war with itself. I think what Torah is showing us right here is that our liberation is bound up with each other because it is on the backs of other people's suffering. Like it's bound up, it's the shadow and the light. And so I'm just really focused on, I guess this is the Shekhinah, because in form, you cannot have form without shadow. I mean, didn't Reb Zalman, he said this all the time, to know the shadow. And I guess I want us as a people and as individuals to really encounter the shadow of our liberation, and what does that call us to do? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of us reading this, those are exactly the kind of. It's hard to imagine the story. Literally, we actually very quickly go to this place of, this is obviously a tale of suffering and immense suffering and immense pain, and we see the Egyptians and the Israelites in a dance together, and this is part of the dance. And so what is this, right? What is it? Is the Germans paying reparations to Israel for in perpetuity, trying in some way, some gesture, an empty what kind of gesture can they make after the 6 million? Is it America being reparations for the African Americans and for slavery, and that gesture as a recognition of some way, is it only on the energetic level? Is it some kind of, like, where is this in terms of justice, and what are the, in a world where suffering, where people act out of ignorance and in darkness so frequently, what is the role of concrete steps in that world, right? In the world of allegory and metaphor? I think that's a larger question. But certainly on the inner plane here, there's certainly, as you said, a dance between the liberation of the Israelite people and its interweaving with the liberation of the Egyptians, or the characters played by each of them in this drama, right? What is the role each of them has to play? And they're obviously interconnected. They're not two. They're not separate, right? The shadow of Egyptian enslavement is maybe the shadow also of the Israelites taking advantage of that. Who knows? Like, I think that there's a little bit of that in both of these stories. So thank you for that, Daniel. We have quite a number of hands here. So Daniel, and then Tony, Richard, Joyce, and Jay, and we're going to close it there so we can finish with these last two texts. Go ahead, Daniel.
I will try to be brief. I had a quick reflection on the relationship or connection between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And yes, the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. And there was a time when there was this peak moment of Egyptian and Israelite connectedness. And it's easy, this is the first time I've actually thought about this, because I read it very carefully, what happens in the way that Pharaoh, the old Pharaoh, honors Jacob with this amazing funeral procession, where the elders of Egypt, all these Egyptians, go on this pilgrimage to go to Canaan, and really express their appreciation of who Jacob was, in honor of Joseph's request that Pharaoh do this. And so there's this moment of Egyptian Israelite connectedness that's really kind of the high point, maybe, in the book of Genesis there. But then Shemot opens with, there's a king that does not remember Joseph. A king does not remember Joseph. And I'm just wondering if on some level, over all the years that the Israelites were in Egypt, maybe there were Egyptians who still felt connected to the Israelites on some level, that we don't hear it in the Torah, but maybe there's a remnant of this light and connectedness among the people. If there were 600,000 Israelites, how many millions of Egyptians were? Maybe there was more connectedness than we really appreciate.
Really beautiful. Thank you for that. That's another thread here. You wove a thread back into the story and harkened back to it, like in a way, somewhat to what our sister Roberta was just saying about, like, that our destinies were interwoven at one point, and that's actually coming back here at the end. That there's an interweaving of our, rising and falling, and maybe there's a way to read this moment as a way to be back in the reciprocity and in the generosity that once was. And
exactly.
I love that. Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate that. All right, Brother Tony, go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
and
Shalom.
Happy New Year, Rabbi,
Happy
and
New Year.
all of us. First of all, just to add to what you just said, Rabbi David, one of the most jarring and heartrending passages in the whole Torah, it seems to me, and I don't think I'm alone, is, and a great cry arose in Egypt. So we're not only interwoven, we're all holy brothers and sisters, the Egyptians and the Israelites. And to come back to that point, which Roberta and Daniel both so drove home with your further comments is really worth dwelling in, I think. That's one thing. The second thing, going back to Paul's beautiful comments, is I'm also inclined to see the silver and gold as less concrete and more metaphorical, both with the golden calf and otherwise. And this goes back to my first comment at Romemu some years ago, Rabbi David, which is quoting Yeats's poem, The Song of Wandering Angus, where he ends it saying, "And pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun." And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, leave it at that, because I'm going to come back to that. That's great, Tony. Thank you. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And we're going to come back to that in literally 3 minutes after we do a little piece from Beno Jacob. But first, Richard, Joyce, and Jay. Go ahead, Richard.
Good morning. Shabbat Shalom.
Good morning, my friend. Shabbos.
The comments so far have looked backwards mostly. Let's look forward. The gold and silver also shows up in the Mishkan. And there's this gift-giving moment when the Israelites, when asked to donate to the construction of the Mishkan, give so much that God finally has to say, stop, enough, enough, enough. And so that further complexifies this issue about the meaning and symbolic importance of the gold and the silver and the wealth. Where did it come from? And of course, the Israelites were in the desert. They don't have gold and silver, presumably, in the desert. Where did it come from? The only obvious source is from the departure from Mitzrayim. So there's another potential way in which this stuff gets used. And we still pay homage to that by beautifying as best we can the artifacts that we use in the synagogue. The Torah, the way the Torah is dressed, and all the rest. So it's interesting to think about what the gold and silver means, not just as gift giving by the Israelites, but looking backward through the material that we're reading today about what the significance and symbolic importance is of gift giving and wealth by that.
Absolutely.
If that's what it actually means. And that further complexifies the notion of whether the stuff that we got from the Egyptians was by coercion or by gift.
Exactly. So let's go there in one more minute, Joyce, and then Jay. Joyce, you have to unmute.
I won't expound, but although this Pharaoh did not know Joseph, this Pharaoh was brought up as a brother of Moshe
Yes.
in the same household.
Yes.
And that has to have a lot of impact on this whole story and that we've been discussing. I mean, they were brothers.
Brother or father figure, depending on how you, right. It certainly has a major impact. And the story of Moshe and his relationship with Pharaoh and its motivation and what it tells us psycho-spiritually about, also about, proximity to power and proximity to evil. All of that is woven into the story in the Exodus narrative in the most amazing way. And certainly, we could talk about it more broadly, but I appreciate that comment here at the end here, Joyce. Go ahead, Jay, and just before we come in for a landing, go ahead, Jay.
I've put my hand up and down, trying not to repeat or expand on things that have been said. However, there's something that's been hinted at that's really bothering me. I don't expect an answer. You were closest to it, Rabbi, when you talked about the role of concrete steps. Here we are talking about Bo, about Zohar, about poetry, about all kinds of things. And we live in a society that basically has benefited from, and for whom there are still dire consequences of a people that basically was enslaved for a similar period of time. Where's our community? Where's our clergy? Where are our scholars? Where are our activists? Where are we in applying what's like glaring before us into probably one of the key issues of our time?
Well, I'm gonna just come to this for a landing here in this last source and not open that up, because here's the truth about that, Jay, is that as we've just seen in the last hour, it's not actually clear to us how to read this moment on any level. Like, we haven't had a resounding group here of the 70 or almost 70 people who are happy with the way that the Israelites have behaved and aren't on board. And I think that's a very complicated, making this into a direct class, which we could do, on how Judaism views reparations and how the rabbis view reparations, how this moment, right, should be read. I think there isn't unanimity in this room, let alone in the broader Jewish community, let alone in the African American community, let alone in the broader American population. So I think if you'd like to find, I'm happy to send you rabbis who have given powerful sermons on the need for reparations, including my dear friend and colleague Rabbi Sharon Brous and others. And I can also send you to other rabbis who don't agree. And there's a plethora and abundance of perspectives on this particular issue. And I wasn't trying to wade into that particular issue in a very concrete way today, although at some future point, perhaps we should, if that feels like it, but not on Shabbat morning. I just wanted to raise this. And so I want to finish with this source. And thank you, Jay, for waiting to say that. And I think that it was important to hear that too, and I appreciate that. Here's the last source as we come in for a landing. The last source, and then a source that I'll also give you on, outside of the text. This source is from the great scholar Beno Jacob, and in it I'm going to read you in the Hebrew here, starting here. Belibo shel ben Yisrael haya Hashem hamitzri kashur b'zichronot marim biyoter. Beno Jacob in 1924 writes that in the heart of the Israelite, the word and name Egyptian was connected, was associated with memories that were bitter, extremely bitter. Lo haya b'zeh mishum pela ilu sana ben Yisrael et hamitzri. It wasn't wondrous at all that an Israelite would hate the Egyptian. He says, how would an Israelite perform the rigorous and vigorous commands of the Torah to treat the stranger with respect when it came to the stranger who was an Egyptian in their midst? Wouldn't the association of an Israelite or a Jew with the word German or the word Israelite conjure such hatred that would make the commands and the rigor of the Torah's standard for treating people with kavod and honor? Wouldn't that be impossible? Ha-ketzad. Halimitzri erchash ahava. Would you love the Egyptian? Kasher tziviti leger tziveti v'ahavtem lo kamocha? Would you love the neighbor as yourself if that neighbor was an Egyptian? Wouldn't you have, weren't our ancestors suffering in Egypt? Aval Torah omeret, hein shalchu itchem sof sof kraim umatanot klei kesef klei zahav v'nagu b'chem kishem shenitztavitim atem linog be'eved ivri. Says, the Torah says Beno Jacob, you will say to your future self, as Brother Richard said, you'll say to the future Israelite, don't you remember that they sent you away the same way the Torah tells you to send away the Hebrew slave? You were sent with gifts and with gold and with silver. They, in the end, they did for you. They acted for you. They were generous toward you. They did the right thing in the end, right? And therefore, the later text in the Torah in Deuteronomy 23:8 can say, do not hate, do not abhor the Egyptian. You were once a stranger in their land. Says that because, right, for all of those reasons, right, it was to soften the gaze of the Israelite when they saw the Egyptian, when they saw the one who once had caused them pain, in order that they not forgetting, but forgiving, that this giving was a gesture of forgiveness to allow the Israelites in the future to open their hearts and their minds towards the Egyptians. And in that way also, psycho-spiritually, the question of how we leave trauma, how we leave pain, how we leave relationships and historical experiences that themselves might have at the time felt so harmful and so painful. But in retrospect, if there was some silver lining, some gold lining to extract from it, maybe we might be able to look with a less jaundiced eye and a less painful eye. And in that way, the Kabbalah and Chassidut, and here will end, very much taking off what Brother Richard and Tony and Daniel and others have said. The entire moment here is a moment in Kabbalah called birur, of extracting holy sparks from the place of narrowness. That in the writings of Kabbalah and in the writings of Chassidut, to leave a place and ask it what it has to offer you is to ask, as Ilana said, to ask the Shekhinah to go into the place of narrowness and say, what gifts do I bring from that? What gifts can I bring forward, and then become and plate the Mishkan, the sacred tabernacle, is constructed from the extracted, as it were, gold and silver from a place of deep pain and narrowness. And in a way, this becomes, when people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, there's also post-traumatic growth as well. That there is a possibility of golden apples, right? There's a possibility of being able to extract, in the language of Chassidut, nitzotzot shel kitusha, right? The holy sparks, as it were, that are trapped in the places of constriction and of pain. And in that way, for the Hasidic masters, they render this conversation from the very concrete around justice and reparations to the psycho-spiritual dimension of how we reframe and transform pain, and how it is that we might leave a place of narrowness with greater wealth than we had entered it. That's a tall order. It's not easy, and I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it at all, but I think that what's possible here in this teaching, and I hope that you'll discuss as I'm going to leave and go prepare for davening, is, that allegorical reading for some can feel a little bit too, abstract. For some it can feel really real, like that's the way we go back, right? That's the way we're able to leave a place. We leave it with the silver and gold, the lessons, the culture, the things that were constructive, right? As Richard was saying, right? What does it mean to go and build a Mishkan out of the gold and silver of a place you lived in for 430 years, right? The Israelites were Egyptians. That's what we can't forget that. By the time the Israelites left Egypt, they were fully Egyptian, right? In fact, our tradition acknowledges it as such, right? There are a lot of rabbinic statements that say that when the Israelites left, they were indistinguishable from the Egyptians. Halalu of, these and these, they're like, they looked like my father and my grandfather who left Berlin in 1938, speaking German, looking like good German Jews, right? There is something to this day of acknowledging, that the gifts that we, intentionally or unintentionally absorbed and took with us, and all of the beautiful Torah that was here. So I just want to close with a thank you to all of you for wading into this. And I'm sure that you'll have much to say in the next 10 minutes